The female gonads are known as ovaries. Now, a gonad is basically a structure that produces gametes, and that means that our ovaries are the reproductive organs of the female, and they are responsible for producing the female gametes known as egg cells or ovum. Now, not only that, but the ovaries also act as endocrine glands. They produce and release special types of hormones known as the female sex hormones. So they produce estrogen as well as progesterone. Now, before we discuss what these two hormones are and what their function is, let's briefly discuss the structure of our female reproductive system. So we have two ovaries inside our female reproductive system. We have one and we have the second one. So inside the ovary, we basically have the maturation and the production of the egg cells, our ovum. So once our ovum is basically mature, it will undergo a process known as ovulation, and the ovary will release that egg cell, that ovum, into a cavity known as our peritoneal cavity. And that ovum, the egg cell, will then travel from the peritoneal cavity into a canal known as our fallopian tube. So the fallopian tube basically connects our ovary to the uterus. Now, eventually, the ovum will make its way to our uterus, which is this section here. And if we have the presence of sperm cells inside the female reproductive system, then the sperm cell can combine with our ovum in a process known as fertilization, and that produces our diploid cell, the zygote. And once the zygote is inside the uterus, it attaches onto the outer membrane, the lining of the uterus, known as the endometrium. And what the endometrium does is it supplies the developing zygote with the nutrients that it needs to actually develop further. Now, if there is no sperm cells found in our female reproductive system, then when the egg cell actually reaches our uterus, what happens is the egg cell, the ovum, along with the lining of the uterus, the endometrium, is released into the surrounding environment. And this process takes place about a month in the female human organism. So this process is known as the menstrual cycle. So let's zoom in on our zygote, on our ovary. We basically get the following diagram. So this diagram basically describes the process by which our follicles mature into our ovum, into our egg cell. So we begin with these tiny little dots known as the primary follicles. They mature into the oocyte, then they become the secondary follicle, and that secondary follicle eventually undergoes the process of ovulation. This is the release of the secondary follicle. It's the release of the mature ovum, the mature egg cell, into the cavity known as the peritoneal cavity. And then, once released into our peritoneal cavity, it travels into our fallopian tube and eventually into our uterus. Now, the remaining portion of our secondary follicle, the remaining portion of the ovarian follicle, which is the basic unit of structure of our ovary, this remaining portion that is left behind in the ovary eventually becomes a structure known as the corpus luteum. And this is a very important structure in both our menstrual cycle as well as pregnancy. And we'll see what its function is in just a moment. So let's discuss these two hormones. Let's begin with estrogen and then let's move on to progesterone. So estrogen is a steroid hormone. That means it's lipid soluble. So that means it can easily travel across a cell membrane, and it basically binds to the protein receptor inside that cell. And eventually estrogen enters our nucleus of the cell, and it acts on the cell on a transcriptional level. It influences the transcription of our cell. Now, estrogen itself is stimulated by our luteinizing hormone as well as the follicle stimulating hormone that are released by the anterior pituitary gland. And FSH as well as LH are both stimulated by the gonadotropin releasing hormone released by the hypothalamus. So estrogen is basically released by two structures. So estrogen is initially released by our ovarian follicle, this structure here. Now, once our ovulation process actually takes place and we form the corpus luteum, then the corpus luteum begins to release our estrogen. So we have two structures inside our ovary that are capable of releasing our estrogen hormone. So estrogen is released by the ovarian follicle, which is the basic unit of the structure inside the ovary. It is also released by the corpus luteum, which is the portion of the follicle that is left behind in the ovary following the release of our ovum, the mature female gamete, into our peritoneal cavity and eventually into the fallopian tube. Now, what exactly is the purpose of estrogen? So basically, when the secondary follicle is still inside our ovary, estrogen is released by that follicle, and what it basically does is it generates our endometrium. It is responsible for generating and thickening the endometrium, which is the layer of membrane in the uterus that serves as the binding site for our zygote. The zygote is the combination of the sperm and our egg. This process of combining is known as fertilization. Now, the second purpose of estrogen is basically to promote the development of female secondary sex characteristics, such as our enlargement of breasts, as well as the growth of body hair in different parts of the body. It also is responsible for increasing the muscle mass and bone mass of women. Now, let's move on to the other type of female sex hormone known as progesterone. So, progesterone is also a steroid hormone. That means it's formed from cholesterol and it is lipid soluble. It passes across the cell membrane and it binds onto protein receptors inside the target cell. Now, progesterone is stimulated by the luteinizing hormone LH that is released by the anterior pituitary gland. So, as our amount of LH in the blood increases, the amount of progesterone released also increases. Now, progesterone is initially released by the corpus luteum. So, after ovulation takes place and the ovum is released into our peritoneal cavity, the corpus luteum eventually forms, and that corpus luteum begins to release our progesterone hormone. Now, once our corpus luteum actually degenerates during the process of pregnancy, our placenta, the structure that basically supplies the growing fetus with nutrients, begins to release our progesterone. So we have two structures that are capable of releasing progesterone. Initially, it's the corpus luteum, but eventually, when the corpus luteum degenerates during the process of pregnancy, it's the placenta that releases our progesterone. Now, what exactly is the function of progesterone? So it has many important functions, and one of the most important functions is the maintenance of the endometrium. So it's the estrogen that generates and thickens that endometrium, but it's progesterone that maintains the endometrium as our ovum travels through the fallopian tube and during the process of pregnancy. So progesterone is used to maintain the endometrium during the menstrual cycle as well as during pregnancy if the sperm actually combines with our egg. Now, it also inhibits the process of lactation during pregnancy, and it also decreases the ability of the smooth muscle inside the uterus to basically contract. And this is important because we don't want our muscles in the uterus to contract too early during the process of pregnancy. So this is our ovary. So once again, the ovary is the female gonad that acts as an endocrine gland and forms two important female sex hormones, the estrogen and progesterone. And both of these play an important role in not only the female menstrual cycle, but also in the process of pregnancy.